We are now more than a week into a weather pattern that has not let go of the eastern half of this country. And I need you to understand that what's building right now over the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley isn't a new, isolated event. It's the next chapter in the exact same story I've been tracking since the middle of last week. Today, storms are already organizing over the upper Midwest. Tomorrow, that threat sharpens into what I'd call the marquee severe weather day of the week, stretching from Minneapolis to Pittsburgh, with damaging wind, large hail, and a couple of tornadoes all on the table. And by Tuesday, the whole thing picks up and moves again, this time toward the mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas. So let's actually walk through what could happen day by day, because this is exactly the kind of multi-day setup where knowing what's coming matters, as much as knowing what's happening right now. It's Monday, July 27th, 2026. Let's get into it. Before I get into the day-by-day breakdown, I want to zoom out, because I think the bigger pattern here is honestly the more important story. For more than a week now, an upper-level ridge has been building over the Rockies and the western high plains, stretching all the way up into south-central Canada, while a trough has stayed anchored over the eastern United States, with a second trough sitting out in the northeastern Pacific. That's essentially the same three-piece setup I've described in several videos now: a ridge that won't move, bookended by troughs on either side that also won't move. The latest extended forecast discussion from the Weather Prediction Center is now explicitly calling for a lengthy heat wave across much of the western and southern U.S., continuing through next weekend, which tells you this pattern isn't breaking down anytime soon. It's just going to keep producing the same basic outcome it's produced for over a week. Dangerous heat parked over one part of the country, and repeated rounds of severe weather and flooding cycling through underneath that eastern trough. Today, that eastern trough is doing exactly what it's been doing all week, reloading the severe weather threat in a new spot. Right now, embedded shortwave disturbances are riding along the northern part of that pattern, and as they shift eastward through the day, the mid-level flow above the upper Midwest is increasing, which is helping organize thunderstorms across the upper Mississippi Valley and into the upper Midwest. These storms are capable of producing heavy rainfall and damaging wind gusts, and because a lot of this same general region has already taken on rain earlier in this stretch, there's a real risk of isolated flash flooding wherever the ground is already saturated from previous storms. If you're in Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Iowa today, this isn't the headline day of the week, but it's not nothing either, and it's genuinely the fuel for what happens tomorrow. Tomorrow, Monday, is where this becomes the story I actually want you paying attention to. The severe weather threat shifts and intensifies across the Great Lakes and into the Ohio Valley, and this is shaping up to affect a genuinely large footprint of major cities. Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Chicago, Indianapolis, Detroit, and Pittsburgh could all see damaging winds with a couple of tornadoes and large hail also possible by the time Monday wraps up. If you live in or near any of those cities, tomorrow deserves real attention, not just a passing glance at the forecast. Here's the mechanical setup behind it, and I want to walk through this carefully because it's a slightly unusual kind of severe weather day. Seasonably strong northwesterly flow aloft is going to spread over a very warm, moist, and unstable environment running from the upper Midwest and Great Lakes into the Central Plains. That creates what forecasters call a conditionally favorable environment across a genuinely broad region, meaning the big picture ingredients for severe weather, heat, moisture, and some wind aloft are all in place across a wide area. But here's the catch. The actual triggering mechanisms, the specific disturbances that decide exactly where and how intensely storms fire, are described as subtle, which is forecaster language for the ingredients are there, but there isn't one obvious, sharp trigger like a strong, cold front punching through to tell us precisely where the worst storms will end up. That combination, broad, favorable ingredients plus subtle forcing, creates real uncertainty about exactly which specific communities inside that broad corridor end up dealing with the strongest storms, even though the overall risk across the region is genuinely elevated. It's a good example of a day where the confidence in somewhere in this corridor is getting hit hard is much higher than the confidence in this specific city is getting hit hard, which is exactly why I'm giving you the whole list of cities, rather than pretending I can tell you precisely which one draws the short straw. It's worth understanding why northwesterly flow aloft specifically tends to produce a different flavor of severe weather than the southwesterly flow setups I've walked you through in some of my other videos this month. When the wind well above the surface is coming generally out of the northwest rather than curving up from the southwest, storms tend to organize into faster-moving clusters and bowing line segments that race along with the flow, rather than the more isolated, slower-moving rotating supercells you get when southwesterly flow interacts with a strong, sharp, cold front. Fast-moving bowing segments are historically very efficient at producing widespread wind damage over a large area in a short amount of time, precisely because they're moving quickly enough to carry that damaging wind across dozens of miles within an hour or two, rather than concentrating the worst of it in one narrow corridor, the way a slower moving supercell might. That's part of why tomorrow's threat is being described across such a wide list of cities rather than one specific narrow track. A northwesterly flow pattern like this one tends to spread its impact horizontally across a broad swath rather than funneling it down one precise line. On top of the severe thunderstorm threat, Monday also carries its own flood risk layered right on top of the wind and hail concern. The Weather Prediction Center has a marginal risk of excessive rainfall posted for Monday, stretching from the Four Corner states across the Central Plains and into the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. A marginal risk is the lowest tier on that 4-level excessive rainfall scale. Marginal, slight, moderate, and high, but paired with ground that may already be saturated from today's storms in some spots, it's still worth knowing that Monday isn't purely a wind and hail story. There's a real, if lower-end flooding component riding along with it in the same general corridor. I want to bring in a small, genuinely useful example of how this kind of forecast actually gets communicated on the ground, because I think it says something important about how to think about days like tomorrow. Earlier this week, emergency management officials in Clinton County, Ohio, issued an early heads-up notice flagging that the Storm Prediction Center had placed part of southwest Ohio inside a Day 5 outlook for Monday, while being upfront that confidence in the exact location and intensity was still low that far out, and specifically telling residents not to be alarmed by an outlook issued nearly a week in advance, just to start paying attention as confidence improved closer to the day. That's exactly the right way to receive an early outlook like that. And now that we're inside 24 hours of it, that early flag has firmed up into a real, multi-city severe weather threat, which is exactly the kind of validation that early heads-up was designed to eventually lead to. By Tuesday, the whole system picks up and shifts again, this time toward the mid-Atlantic and the southeast. Philadelphia, Washington, Baltimore, Raleigh, and Charlotte could all see storms. Tuesday, with the mechanism behind it worth understanding on its own terms, rather than just assuming it's a copy of Monday's setup. A shortwave trough that starts out over the lower Great Lakes Tuesday morning is forecast to evolve into a closed low over the mid-Atlantic by afternoon. A closed low is exactly what it sounds like. Instead of a simple dip in the jet stream that opens back up and slides through, the flow actually wraps all the way around itself, forming a self-contained pocket of spinning low pressure that can sit somewhat in place and behave a little more unpredictably than a straightforward, fast-moving disturbance. That's part of why forecasters flagged more uncertainty around Tuesday specifically. Closed lows have a well-earned reputation among meteorologists for evolving in ways that are harder to pin down precisely, even inside a 48-hour window. Within that developing feature, a belt of enhanced mid-level flow spreads from the Ohio Valley into Virginia and North Carolina by afternoon, which is what ends up dragging the severe threat into that mid-Atlantic corridor specifically. At the same time, farther south, a very moist air mass is expected to build moderate to strong instability by afternoon along a cold front over the southeast. Here's the interesting technical wrinkle for that southern piece. The vertical wind shear is actually expected to stay fairly weak, which normally would limit how organized storms can get. But the buoyancy, essentially how aggressively the atmosphere wants to push air upward, is expected to be strong enough on its own to support locally intense downdrafts. A downdraft is what happens when a thunderstorm's rain-cooled air comes crashing back down to the surface instead of a rotating updraft doing the damage, and when that column of sinking air is powerful enough, it can produce a sudden, damaging burst of straight-line wind at the surface, sometimes with very little warning, even without the storm ever developing the classic rotating structure you'd associate with a tornado threat. So Tuesday's southeast storms may not look as dramatic on radar as a supercell would, but they're capable of producing genuinely damaging wind through that mechanism regardless. Separately, isolated severe wind gusts are also possible farther west, out across the central high plains, on the opposite side of this same broad pattern. Before I get to the mechanism, it's worth pausing on just how consistent this stretch has actually been. Over the past week and a half alone, this general corridor running from the upper Midwest through the Ohio Valley and into the Mid-Atlantic has seen enhanced risk or comparable severe weather days, more times than I can count on one hand. On top of the flash flooding across the southeast, a tropical system that made landfall in Louisiana and then Texas, and a heat dome that's already produced record or near record numbers across the plains and south. Tomorrow's Great Lakes to Ohio Valley threat and Tuesday's Mid-Atlantic shift aren't a break from that pattern. They're simply the newest entries in a list that's been growing all month. If you feel like you've been hearing about a new round of severe weather in roughly the same stretch of the country every few days, that's not your imagination. It's exactly what a stalled ridge and trough pattern looks like when it refuses to break down for this long. I want to take a moment to explain why this pattern keeps behaving this way, because I think understanding the mechanism is more useful than just reacting to each new day's headline. The upper ridge, sitting over the Rockies and western high plains, isn't just sitting there passively. It's actively blocking the normal west-to-east progression of weather systems, which forces the disturbances riding along the trough on the eastern side of the country to keep cycling through roughly the same general corridor instead of clearing out entirely. Each time one of those disturbances rotates through, it reloads the severe weather and flood threat in a slightly different spot along that boundary, which is exactly why we've gone from the upper Midwest today to the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley tomorrow to the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast on Tuesday, without the underlying pattern actually changing at all. It's the same engine, just relocating its output day by day. And on the other side of that same ridge, the reason the West and South are locked into what forecasters are now calling a lengthy heat wave through next weekend is that exact same ridge, parked in place and doing exactly what a heat dome does, suppressing clouds and rain, letting the sun bake the same ground day after day. So here's what I want each of you to actually do with this, broken down by day and by region, because the right response genuinely differs depending on where you live and which day applies to you. If you're anywhere in Minnesota, Wisconsin, or Iowa today, keep an eye on the sky this afternoon and evening, particularly if you're near any low-lying areas that have already taken on rain earlier this week. Isolated flash flooding is a real possibility wherever the ground is already full. This isn't the day to be complacent just because tomorrow is getting more of the attention. If you're in Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Chicago, Indianapolis, Detroit, or Pittsburgh, tomorrow is genuinely your day to prepare. Make sure your phone's emergency alerts are turned on before storms develop. Know the lowest, most interior room in your home away from windows. And don't assume that because the forcing behind tomorrow's storms is described as subtle, that the threat itself is subtle. Subtle forcing with strong instability and favorable shear still produces real damaging wind, real hail, and a real tornado risk. It just means forecasters have less certainty about exactly which town inside that corridor gets hit hardest. Treat the whole corridor as if it could be you, because from where we're sitting today, it genuinely could be. If you've got outdoor plans tomorrow afternoon or evening anywhere in that corridor, especially anything near Lake Michigan or Lake Erie, build in a backup plan now rather than scrambling once storms are already visible on radar, since fast-moving bowing segments in a northwesterly flow pattern like this one can go from a clear sky to a warned storm faster than a lot of people expect. It's also worth a quick plain reminder of the actual mechanics of staying safe once a warning is issued for your area, since a corridor this wide means a lot of people who don't normally think hard about severe weather safety are going to need it this week. For large hail, get inside and away from windows and skylights, and if you're driving, pull off the road under a sturdy overpass or into a covered parking structure rather than trying to outrun a hail core in the open. For damaging straight-line wind, whether it comes from a bowing line segment tomorrow or a downburst on Tuesday, the danger is largely the same as a weak tornado in terms of what it can do to trees, power lines, and light structures, so the same interior room, away from windows guidance applies. And if a tornado warning is issued specifically, get to that lowest, most interior room immediately, rather than waiting to visually confirm a tornado yourself, since, especially in a fast-moving, embedded, severe weather setup like the one expected tomorrow, a tornado can be wrapped in rain and genuinely difficult to see coming until it's very close. I also want to spend a moment on the flip side of this pattern, because I think it's easy to get tunnel-visioned on the severe weather piece and forget that the same setup producing these storms is also producing a genuinely dangerous extended heat situation elsewhere in the country. If you've got family or friends anywhere across the West or the South, this is worth mentioning to them too. The same ridge keeping this severe weather corridor active in the east is expected to keep dangerous heat locked in place out there through next weekend, with no real relief in sight until this entire pattern finally breaks down, whenever that ends up happening. It's worth remembering that a pattern like this doesn't treat every part of the country the same way at the same time. While Minneapolis, Chicago, and Pittsburgh are watching the sky for hail and wind tomorrow, places like Phoenix, Dallas, and much of the Southeast are still dealing with an entirely different hazard from this exact same large-scale setup, just with heat instead of thunderstorms as the delivery mechanism. Understanding that connection is exactly why I keep coming back to the bigger pattern in these videos, instead of treating each day's forecast as its own isolated story. I want to be honest about the limits of what I can tell you this far out too. Today's upper Midwest threat and tomorrow's Great Lakes to Ohio Valley threat are both fairly well supported at this point, but Tuesday's shift toward the mid-Atlantic and southeast still has more uncertainty in exactly how it plays out, partly because it depends on how that shortwave trough actually evolves into a closed low, which is the kind of feature that can behave a little differently than models expect, even inside 48 hours. I'd rather tell you that honestly than pretend I've got Tuesday nailed down with the same confidence as tomorrow. Here's the full shape of it one more time. Today, building storms and a localized flash flood risk across the upper Midwest. Tomorrow, the main event, a wide corridor from Minneapolis to Pittsburgh dealing with damaging wind, large hail, and a couple of possible tornadoes, layered on top of a lower-end flood risk across the same Great Lakes and Ohio Valley corridor. Tuesday, the threat shifts to the mid-Atlantic and southeast, driven by a different mechanism built around intense downdrafts rather than classic rotating storms. And underneath all three of those days, the same stalled ridge and trough pattern that's been running this whole show for over a week now, with no clear sign of breaking down before next weekend at the earliest. I'll be tracking how tomorrow's threat actually verifies across that Great Lakes and Ohio Valley corridor, and I'll have a closer look at Tuesday's mid-Atlantic setup once we're inside a tighter forecast window with more confidence behind it. If anything shifts meaningfully from what I've laid out here, I'll let you know. Have your way to get warnings ready before storms arrive. Know your safe room, follow your local National Weather Service office for anything official in your specific area, and I'll see you in the next one.